Doliwiz, Corey Hinton, and Nujayao, Portland, Wapanaki, Nudabig, Zebayeg, Nagabalund, Best to the Magadnil. My name's Corey Hinton. I live in Portland, here in the Dawnland, and I'm from the community of Zebayeg, which means a place at the edge of the water, and I'm from the Francis family, and I'm Passamaquoddy. I have to introduce myself in a setting like this in Passamaquoddy, knowing that not that long ago we weren't allowed to speak our language. We say that it's really important that we speak our language so that our ancestors can hear it and they know that the language is still being spoke. So I share that, and I like to bring our language to places that I haven't been before, places where our language probably was, well, definitely not allowed. And a country club feels like a pretty good setting for that. I'm deeply humbled and grateful to be here. I didn't write any notes, so sorry. The only thing I wrote is thank you. I wrote thank you to my wife, Allie, my beautiful wife sitting over here. Thank you for being here. Thank you to my mother, Elizabeth, for coming. And say thank you to my good friend, Tim Wilson. Thank you to the HHRC for recognizing me. I can't say enough how humbled I am. Before I get into it, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask for a show of hands for all the seeds of peace in the room. Who's seed? Yeah, that's awesome. My story is probably pretty unique. We focus a lot here, you heard about my work on behalf of Indigenous communities, but I'd be remiss if I didn't paint a little bit of a broader picture of where I come from and why I'm here. I am Ski-Jinawa and Passamaquoddy, Besku to Magadi on my father's side, and I'm Jewish on my mother's side. I'm a Native American Jew. Probably won't meet very many of us. My sister, she's another one. But I think it's important because for me, my formative experiences have been informed on both sides of my lineage by stories of survival and stories of resilience in the face of genocide. I'm probably going to spend most of the time here talking a little bit about my community here down east. But I spent a lot of my earlier years before moving to Maine. I grew up in upstate New York. My mother's side of the family immigrated through Ellis Island, and they settled in the New York area, you know, Brooklyn, holler. I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Several years ago. And I spent actually a fair amount of time there. It's by far the most powerful museum experience I've ever had in my life. The first time I went there was actually with Seas of Peace, with a bunch of Palestinian and Israeli kids, Turks and Greeks, a bunch of really feisty teenagers. And I was blown away by so many of the visuals and just the stark understandings of how depraved humans can be. I went back to that museum several times. I went as the first time I was probably like 13 or 14. But I was an adult and I lived in Washington, D.C., and I went other times just by myself, just to walk through every bit of it and to soak it all in, because it's a part of who I am. My family's survival of that experience. And most of our family left Eastern Europe before the Holocaust. But I remember at one point when my grandparents, my mother's parents were still alive, I remember asking them, there was this, some folks might know this, there's actual like video screen in a part of the museum there where you can look up the populations in these villages that were impacted by the Holocaust. And you could see on one side the number of Jews that lived in these places prior to the Holocaust, and the number of Jews that are living there now. And I looked up it was one of my grandfather's family's villages in Czechoslovakia, and there was no Jews there now. And there was a really healthy population, in the 20s and the 30s. And I think we all know what happened. And that stuck with me. I hate hate, I hate it. My formative years, though, growing up as a person of color in upstate New York, I was surrounded, in the town I grew up in, there were several synagogues. Most of my friends were Jewish. I went to the Jewish Community Center growing up, and I could probably recite a couple of prayers if I really put my mind to it, but I definitely could do it right now on the spot. But it was a really important part of who I was. And so I just want to acknowledge that. And I want to say thank you again for my mom for being there. And I know that my grandparents, my mother's parents, would be so proud that I'm being acknowledged by such a tremendous institution such as this. But even though I grew up in a community where there was a lot of support for people of the Jewish faith, something I didn't really have outside of my immediate household was other people of color who I could look to in my school, who respected me. I dealt with a lot of, nonsense, to put it mildly. I experienced racial violence as a young person. I was targeted, I was beaten up, and I fought back. And I became very intolerant of intolerance in those years. People said things to me that no one should say to another person. And you know what? Everyone always said this in school, they're like, you can't fight. Hell no. Hell no, you gotta fight. Hate, we cannot tolerate it. And so for my formative years, I was in many ways persecuted for being a Native American. I was raised to be proud of who I am. I'm a very proud Passamaquoddy, but it conditioned me to be tough, to stand up for myself, because if I didn't, I would have been beaten up even worse. So that brought me to want to be just a lawyer, a fighter for justice. I didn't really know what I wanted to do necessarily, but the sense of justice and the sense of resisting what's wrong has always been a part of my identity. I was in Washington, D.C. When I was about 20 years old, and I took a course in federal Indian law, it's a course that examines the body of law that exists around how federal, tribal, and state governments interact, and how these allocations of jurisdiction exist between us. And what hit me like a ton of bricks in that class when I was 20 years old was the idea that this entire continent was quote-unquote discovered by Christians, and that the people that were living here, the indigenous people, were displaced because they were not Christian-fearing people, God-fearing Christians. The idea is that this country is founded upon a racist ideology, one that has legalized the subjugation of the indigenous people, a country that's original founding document considered an enslaved person less than one person, but yet this country's Declaration of Independence, espoused these principles that not even worth the paper they're written on, because those were not the principles that this country was founded on. And I learned about this, it's called the doctrine of discovery, this idea that, and it was a papal bull that was first announced during the Crusades to justify the Crusades. It was brought to the United States, and I learned that it was the justification for the taking of the lands that we are now on, where every state capital is, where this nation's capital is. The taking of all of those lands was illegal under American law. And I didn't get it. At that moment it clicked that the experience that I had, the experience that I'd seen the people in my community down east had, it was legal. and it was okay, and it was so systematic that it was organic in the United States that our rights were to be subjugated. When I went back home to my community down east at Zebaic, I saw conditions that are abhorrent. The running water in a lot of the houses, it's brown. Forever, we've never been allowed to drink the water. People are dying of overdoses and suicides, and these environmental factors at rates that are just like really, really scary. Everyone dies young, and that's just the way it is. You don't drink the water, that's just the way it is. Well, that's what I was told. And I said, no, we're not going to allow that. I saw that. I learned the story of my great-grandfather. I learned the story of this World War II veteran who survived literally floating in a life raft in the middle of the Pacific after being torpedoed, who survived being stranded in the woods of Maine, being snowed in one winter. Everybody thought he was dead and he walked out. That was my great-grandfather. He survived all of this only to die in his community at the hands of 5 white men who had gone to Passamaquoddy communities to pick up Native American women. Their intentions were explicit, and when my great-grandfather stood up, he was beaten to death. And when the community and the tribal lawyer said, hey, isn't anybody going to do anything about this? Nothing really happened. Ultimately, my great-grandfather died, another man was beaten within an inch of his life, and his 8-year-old son was also beaten. Only one of the 5 men that committed these crimes was charged with a single crime. It was second-degree manslaughter of my grandfather, my great-grandfather. He was acquitted. All-white jury found him innocent because of self-defense. There was applause. And according to my father, who was told this by his mother, in this courtroom she was told the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And I'll tell you what, those stories, like, that's what's here. That's what you got in front of you. Because of these experiences, I see what's going on in the state, and I know that the policies of the state of Maine are continuations of the genocidal policies that allow those conditions to exist up, down, east. We have to be vigilant, because for too long we were told we didn't matter, our rights didn't matter, and we were steamrolled. I've read so many legal opinions that justify the violations of human and civil rights just because we are different. It'll make your stomach turn. The highest court in this state has spoken that it was imbecility on the parts of the natives and the dictates of humanity on the parts of ours that requires us to impart a certain benevolence to the Native Americans. This is Merch v. Tomer, 1842. The words of Maine's highest court claimed that the dictates of humanity require the subjugation of my people's rights. The Maine Law Court has never repudiated those words. The conditions in these communities are stark. The child poverty rates in the Wabanaki communities are double, triple, quadruple what they are throughout the state of Maine. I mean, we're talking like over half of the children in many of the Wabanaki communities live in poverty. The statewide rate's probably like 15% maybe, which is still too high. Income levels, mortality rates, these all paint a picture of a people that have been systematically stripped of their identity in hopes that they will never pursue self-determination. Well, the problem is they let one too many skeeches off the Reds. You couldn't kill all of us. So today, I'm here as a lawyer for the Passamaquoddy tribe, working out of Drummond-Woodsum. We represent proudly every single one of the tribal nations here in Maine, and we are proud supporters of the Wabanaki efforts to pursue sovereignty. You may not know it, but the tribes here in Maine actually have less rights than all the other tribes in the United States, and that is specifically the result of Maine state policy which the governor of the state of Maine refuses to change. The data is clear. The policies of this state are a rolling genocide. This work continues to be critical for those facts. I've seen too many kids who have lived their lives having no future apparent to them. Too many kids not graduating high school, drinking water that's brown, being told this is just the way it is. So we fight, we have to be vigilant to make sure that there's a brighter future. But it's not just for our indigenous communities here. I see the migrants coming to this country seeking a brighter future. These people, these asylum seekers, that are seeking exactly what the Europeans sought when the Europeans came here. We need to stand up because the system here will swallow people whole. It will swallow communities whole because the system here is not designed to help so much as it's designed to keep things in place. The status quo has never been geared towards true human rights, but that is what we have to demand. So I'm going to invite you all to consider a lingering question. I'm going to ask you all to consider what you've done in the past week to bring humanity around you. I go to work a marginal way, and right now it's a hard place to go to work every day. I see the failures of the state and the federal government's immigration policies. I see the failure of our social policies. I see the deterioration of the social fabric of our society happening on marginal way every single day. When we see this, when we hear this, ask yourself, what have you done to make a difference? And I encourage you all to explore that and to try to find a way to make a difference. To you all on, thank you very much. I'm deeply, deeply humbled